So welcome everybody. We're so very pleased to welcome you to this webinar. This is the second in the series offered by both the TDSB EcoSchools program and OISE's teacher programs in conjunction. My name is Hilary Inwood. I'm the Environmental and Sustainability Lead at OISE, and I'm very happy to be working today with my colleagues from the TDSB EcoSchools program, who I will introduce to you in just 1 minute. I will tell you a little bit about who's in the room. About 30% of you are primary teachers. Another 30% come under the other category today, which I think is the highest we've had in that area. We've got quite a few teacher candidates from OISE, so I'd like to welcome them in particular to this webinar, as they're from my home institution. And we've got a small amount of people who are junior teachers and intermediate and senior teachers. So whichever educational institution you come from, whether you were teaching in person or whether you were teaching virtually, we're really happy to welcome you to this webinar today. As you know, this is one of a long series of webinars that we will be offering all year to help increase your professional learning when it comes to environmental and sustainability education. And today's topic is of incredible importance as we figure out how to use the pandemic as an opportunity to move into a more equitable and sustainable world. And so I'm very happy to welcome my colleagues from the EcoSchools program as the panelists for today's session. So first of all, I'm going to introduce you to Pam Miller. Pam is, she's presently, well, I shouldn't say presently, she has been for many years, much to our delight, the EcoSchools instructional leader with the TDSB. She has over 28 years of experience working in education, both in outdoor education, environmental education, and as a classroom teacher. And she finds herself back in the classroom now. So like many of you, she was redeployed in the last few weeks, and she is now teaching a grade 8 class of 32 students. So that will be stories for later on, I think, in the webinar, maybe in the chat at the end. I'd also like to introduce you to Jenn, who has a background. She's a member of one of the EcoSchools team. She's a background in environmental anthropology and has been with the EcoSchools team for the past 16 years. She provides support to school teams to help them take climate action in their communities every single day. And she also works with central departments to make the TDSB more sustainable in their everyday practices. And she is very passionate about dogs. She's known for walking her dogs for hours and hours every day, Jenn, along the shores of Lake Ontario. And then I'd also like to introduce you to Chris Metropolis, who's a new member. Let's welcome the EcoSchools team. Chris worked at the Toronto Urban Studies Centre in outdoor education for 16 years previously to joining the EcoSchools team. He enjoys bringing technology to the outdoors, even when it doesn't work, because that's what kids like to use. So he's learned some of the secrets. Maybe he'll share those with us, Chris, as we go through today. And he certainly hopes to bring this experience to the EcoSchools team. I'd also like to welcome Maddie Simpkins, who's the EcoSchools intern right now, and just recognize Grace Keeble as well, who has one of the other EcoSchools interns who's not able to join us. And a little shout out to my very close colleague, Elise Kennedy, who's one of the doctoral students at OISE, who helps to keep both the EcoSchools program and the ESE initiative at OISE in line. So we're happy to welcome Elise to the room as well. So welcome to everybody. And I'm going to turn it over to the EcoSchools team now.
Great. Thank you, Hilary. Chris, if you want to put me up, yep, perfect. With this summer's work on climate justice and what we've heard with Black Lives Matter and all the upheavals, both social and through the pandemic, we thought it behooves us to really look at how environmental education can contribute to a just recovery. So we did have a chance to poll you. We'll be asking you later who is teaching virtually. So great, so welcome. Next slide. Great, and I'm just going to skip this one because really we've introduced ourselves. So let's move right to the land acknowledgement. I got to actually do a little bit of digging. I was looking for some modern Indigenous work. And so this work was featured in the National Gallery of Canada in Ottawa in 1992. And Rebecca Belmore created this installation. And it's called The Gathering of People for Any Purpose. She's an interdisciplinary Anishinaabe artist who is particularly notable for politically conscious and social aware performance and installation work. She's an Ojibwe and a member of the Overshoot gang. I apologize for butchering that. Belmore currently lives in Toronto, What I like about this installation is she placed several chairs from her own kitchen as well as the homes of other women in her life in a circle upon the floor she constructed out of plywood and painted with flowers. A pair of headphones sat on each chair, and visitors were invited to take a seat and put on the headphones, through which they heard stories of struggle and triumph from various Indigenous women. And so I love this because today is about stories and other stories and centering stories that have been marginalized. We acknowledge we are hosted on the lands of the Mississaugas of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Wendat. We also recognize the enduring presence of all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. All right, next. So wow, yesterday we were rehearsing and I had the stats from the day before at 478 or something. And then my team said, oh my gosh, did you hear the stats from today? 700 new COVID cases. So as you know, COVID pandemic has completely changed our lives. Both our social interactions, our mobility have been severely restricted. Our finances and job security drastically impacted those of us who may not be in the education system. And some have experienced the loss of family and friends. And we just want to acknowledge that. Next slide, please. The impact of schools have, now that we're back, have really impacted on how we do schools. High schools have seen the biggest challenges, including the introduction of a quadmester and absolutely no extracurriculars for anybody. If you're a high school student, you attend school for part of the day on alternating days, and you're doing both virtual and in-class. There are now more than 18,000 TDSB students in the virtual secondary school. For elementary schools, those that went into schools, you've got social distancing, classroom cohorts and masks, and with over 60,000 TDSB elementary students in virtual classrooms, with many more to be placed. And so some of you are in that situation right now. Next slide, please. However, there's also been an impact on our environment. And according to Science Direct, COVID has indirectly impacted the environment in both positive and negative ways. Positive effects, next slide, include improvements in air quality through a decrease in carbon emissions, clean beaches in some areas, and less environmental noise. Cities around the world report seeing and hearing more wildlife. Negative effects include increased waste, especially medical waste, including mass, and the reduction of recycling. We've also seen a rise in online activity, as shown in the energy area of this infographic. However, that can also increase our carbon emissions if the electricity is fossil fuel based, which it is in many countries. So here's a question for you. What have you noticed in the environment near you? So put your ideas in the chat. I think I was following someone on Facebook that in Markham, they had a black bear go through their neighborhood. So if you've noticed something about your neighborhood, put that in the chat. What have you noticed around in the world around you, in your communities? Have you noticed the air cleaner? Have you noticed any wildlife? Yes, at the farmer's market. Yes, oh, more birds of prey. This is great. More squirrels, more birds. Oh, lovely. Absolutely. Lots of people taking advantage of our green spaces. Oh my gosh, rats. Yikes. Peace and quiet. I noticed fewer airplanes. I'm in Mississauga, and definitely the flight passages were quieter. Yes, we got to know our places and our backyards. I have become intimately connected with my backyard. So absolutely, lots of different things you've noticed. I love the story about in California that our songs, or the sparrows, were singing a different melody because they could add the trills to attract mates. Oh my goodness, family of foxes at the beach. Yes, all right, so continue adding that. Next slide, Chris. What has been especially important, however, is how the pandemic has revealed how deeply social and ecological systems are interconnected and interdependent. The pandemic has magnified existing issues of racism, poverty, and social environmental conditions in neighborhoods across the city. Specifically, members of our Black community represented 21% of the reported COVID-19 cases in the city, despite the fact that census data indicates that only 9% of Toronto's population identifies as Black. Conversely, those who identify as white represent about 48% of Toronto's population, but only 17% of reported COVID cases or only 17% of the reported COVID cases in the city. These maps, so I have a map of the ultrafine particles. You can see where that's concentrated. The heat exposure index, so as climate change impacts our city, we'll start to see heat areas become hotter. And then of course, areas covered by trees, so areas that you would go for relief, for wellness. And what we see is the areas impacted by COVID are also disproportionately in areas where they have poor environmental conditions. The challenge is that the poor environmental conditions might magnify or exacerbate a person's vulnerability to becoming infected by COVID. Pollution from traffic has been linked to a number of ailments such as asthma, heart disease, and high rates of adult premature death. It shows that those who live close to major roadways could be breathing in higher levels of ultrafine particles. And they're particularly troubling because they're 1,000 times smaller than the width of a human hair, and they have a greater ability to penetrate deeper into the lungs and travel in the body. So people in these areas might be taking in 10 million of these pollutants with every breath. And as you know, our COVID is affecting the respiratory system. So think about how things are adding on top of each other. Next slide. You may have heard as well that access to nature or being in nature as a person of color may not feel safe. And a most recent example of Christian Cooper was filmed by a white woman who called the police on him because he was trying to get her to put her dog on a leash. And so when the public health encourages us to go outside for wellness, people of color, people with different abilities, the LGBTQ plus communities, or those in lower socioeconomic classes either cannot access local natural spaces, maybe they're not welcomed, denied access, or they don't feel safe. Carol Findlay, in her book, Black Faces, White Spaces, argues that the legacies of slavery, Jim Crow, and racial violence have shaped cultural understandings of the great outdoors and determined who should and who can have access to natural spaces. Next slide, please. So there are many types of environmental justice. I actually stole this idea from Hillary and her presentation about eco-justice. Geographic injustice. So you might be close to something like a landfill. Where Toronto throws their trash is we have the Green Lane is very close to an Indigenous area. And so we are polluting their neighborhood. We have social-economic injustice. Those with power and money dominate the culture. Dominate what happens on the land. So again, thinking about white privilege. Interspecies justice, believing only that humans have rights or voice. The land and nature are sold and bought like commodities and don't ever get a chance to say anything. And intergenerational injustice. We are meeting our present needs at the expense of future generations. An example is Earth Overshoot Day. It marks the date when humanity's demand for ecological resources and services in a given year exceeds what the Earth can regenerate in that year. And it's often in the middle in June. So that is very scary. Next slide, please. So if we're going to move towards a just recovery and overcome the systemic racism and oppression that we've had, we need to rethink how we do environmental education. And there is a movement out that's been out for a while called ecojustice. I pulled up this paper from the Second National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit. We really talked about how environmental education has failed to address the issues of environmental justice and the lack of diversity. And so we are, as environmental education educators, we have contributed and supported policies and curriculum that have perpetuated historic, systemic, oppressive relationships by either not validating or presenting diverse perspectives, counter narratives, identities, and discourse. And so we really need to rethink how we do things. So if we're going to work towards a just recovery and tackle systemic oppression, again, rethinking is really important. Next slide, please. So what is eco-justice education? Simply, it's the integration of social justice with environmental education. It starts with understanding that the ways in which we currently live and think are not sustainable for human life, nor are they equitable or just. If we go deeper into eco-justice education, it's about educating our students in ways that not only respond to the current conditions on the planet, but also reclaim what it means to belong to each other, the land, the oceans, and to the multitude of living species with whom we share the planet. Eco-justice is about decolonization and the incorporation of Indigenous philosophies and perspectives when examining our understanding of the environment. And lastly, eco-justice is about restoration and revitalization, reclaiming the waters, the lands, the air, soils, and other commons as a means of learning to live more sustainably. An example of just reclaiming is like the bike lanes on Bloors, or reclaiming our public spaces. Next slide, please. So as I got thinking about how I would do this, and again, being redeployed into a grade 8 classroom, I was thinking, how do I tackle eco-justice work? And so I started to do a little bit of connection with Mitch Thomas's book called Ecological Identity. And I realized that the 4 questions that he asks in the book, or that we could all ask, may connect us and build those foundations of our ecological identity. Once we build those foundations together, then we can start working towards adding other stories, other perspectives. And so I started to think of a metaphor. So if eco-justice is like the hands, working to reclaim and repair the relationships among ourselves, kind of the action piece, doing what is important, restoring, then I think of ecological identity as the heart. Why we do what we do, our passions, what values connect me to this work. And again, looking from an Indigenous perspective and a people of color perspective, what as a community connects us to this work? Because often in Western ways of thinking, we're very individualist. In other communities, it's a community. So I was thinking of us as educators. We're almost like the bridge. So David Orr talks about the head, the hands, and the heart. What if eco-justice is the hands, eco-identity is the heart, and we are the bridge that brings us from the heart to the action? Would it help us, would these questions then help us with our students explore and evaluate what it means to belong to each other? Again, the land, the oceans, living species with whom we share the planet. And so I think these 4 questions, looked at through an eco-justice lens, invite us to explore diverse narratives, identities, and perspectives as we work towards building bridges between all of us. Next slide, please. So I'm going to pass this over right now to Chris, who's going to give a great example of how, connecting that first question, what do I know about the place around us, is going to then show us what might that look like in the classroom. And Chris, you come with some great experience having worked in the Toronto Urban Studies Centre. I know we stole you from that. Thanks, Matt Brundle and the team. So over to you, Chris. Go ahead.
Thanks, and good afternoon, everyone. Great to be here and working with you. And going to lead you through an activity that you can do in your schoolyard and the neighborhood. And just in general, anytime you want to take your class outdoors, you need to have a purpose. You need to have something for them to do and keep them busy. And that's something that I learned at Tusk, that if you keep them busy, they stay engaged and they don't start wandering off and playing with other things. And so part of that is making sure they know what to do. And that needs to happen in the class before you go out. Make sure everybody knows exactly what's going to happen, what routines they can expect to follow. Do you have a sound signal, a whistle to get their attention, so that everybody knows what's going to happen before you go outside. Another good thing to do is to actually walk around the space that you want your students to be in and make sure there's nothing dangerous, figure out where are good places to stop and regather if you need to give other instructions, where there's enough room for people and it's safe, and a couple other tips at the bottom there. And so this particular activity can extend beyond the schoolyard, but it doesn't have to. A lot of TDSB properties have a lot of trees, and we are going to be making a tree tour. The difference with this one is that there's going to be different perspectives that your students are going to be using. And I can guarantee you they are perspectives that they've never used before. And so the goal is making that tree tour, collecting about a dozen trees, but they're based on a role. And whatever boundaries you decide to use, make sure that they use the whole area and they're not just clumped in one spot. Get them to move around. And it's really an idea to increase their observational skills. Get them looking at things that they probably walk by every day and never really notice. And so these perspectives actually come from the real world. These are jobs that real people actually do with real trees, except for the tree lover. That's kind of everybody's job. And when they understand that what they're doing actually happens in the real world, there's a lot better buy-in and engagement that certainly I've noticed working at Tusk. More on those in a moment. So we're going to be able to provide you with some materials to do this activity and a lot of PDF resources for each of the roles. And they have, depending on the role, they have 1 to 6 pages of resource material that they're going to use to select their trees with. There's also a record sheet to keep track of the field notes. And there are a number of things that you're going to need to come up with. And so marking the trees, this is something that we did at Tusk using GPS devices. And so if your school has GPS devices, great. The geography department has a set that you can borrow. But even better, why not use your student phones and give them a chance to use the thing that you always tell them to put away. Using any kind of phone, they can log into My Maps, which is part of Google Maps, and they can mark trees very, very easily. If you've got digital cameras, they're super amazing for taking great photos. You'll need 1 per group. And again, if you don't have digital cameras, use another student phone. I think they'll be excited to do that. And finally, you need to figure out what your boundaries are going to be for this activity. For older grades, you may want to go out into the neighborhood. And what we do at Tusk, or did at Tusk, I should say, was have a group on each block, different blocks. And so you can spread out the groups. They don't interact with each other, and it provides them more focus, I certainly discovered. And in terms of those boundaries, you might want to make a map and include those with the instructions. And the very easiest way to do that is actually in Google Earth. And I'll show you in a moment. You can mark it up with boundaries, with routes, with whatever you might need. And you can either print them off separately, or you can embed them in the PDF that we're going to be sharing with you. The other thing to do is you can make them in My Maps, very similar to Google Earth. The benefit there is that you can actually share that map with your student electronically, and they can load it up on their phone and get all the instructions that you might want. And if you don't plan on using devices, that's fine. And you can just print them off on paper and they can mark them up with pencil as they go along. So in Google Earth, this is kind of what it's going to look like when you're getting ready to either save it as an image or to print it off. And you can have legends, title, description, or you can turn those off. You can see here, I'll put a boundary around the schoolyard, but you could have it a path going away from the school to another part of the neighborhood if you're venturing off that way. One of the handy things about Google Earth is that you can rotate the map, so you can make the streets go up and down on the map, and it kind of fits a bit better on a piece of paper. When you use Google My Maps, it has the streets in their actual orientation, which is not to the north. So here's that PDF I was talking about, and we've actually got a reserved spot for a map there in the rectangle. And if you load this up into Acrobat and you click on the rectangle, it's going to load up an image browser, and you can choose what image you want to put there. And you need to export those from Google Earth first. It can be a JPEG or a PDF, doesn't matter. And then once you've selected your image, it'll load into the rectangle there, and you can print them off with the map in there, and it's all contained with the instructions. This is what it looks like in My Maps. If you're venturing away from the schoolyard, I would probably suggest using this because you can have a nice plain looking base map. It's a lot easier to see anything that you put on the map in terms of routes or boundaries. You can change the base map. So if you want, you can put the satellite view back on if you want to see the trees. But I would say you can see that you can't see where the boundary is very clearly there. When you do print from My Maps onto paper, you still get the title and the legend as well. But you can see the streets are not up and down. If you are printing in black and white, which may be the case for a lot of schools, it doesn't look too bad. I would suggest using white boundaries if you're going to do that. They kind of show up the best. And the description area is really easy to jazz up with other things for names and date and whatever else you might want to have them right on the map to keep track of it. So that works out pretty well. So the first step in this is to form groups, and at Tusk we typically do groups of 2 to 4. You can do a group of 1 if you're teaching virtually, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But whatever group you form, they need to then choose a role. And at Tusk we like using this raft format to just to give them something to choose, and these roles allow them to pick something that they're more interested in, and they have to, as a group, collectively decide. Good to get at least 1 group per role. And this makes doing any kind of presentation afterwards a lot more exciting because it's not all the same presentation again and again, but different things. And we have put together the different audiences that the projects are meant to target, as well as the topics based on the role. You're welcome to change those up, but the resource materials that we provide are tied to these things here. Second step is explaining what all the jobs are. And there's 4 jobs, but again, depending on how big the group is, you can double them up or more. But the supervisor has the resource materials and kind of leads the group a little bit. But I found after the first tree or 2 that it really becomes a group project, and everybody chips in to decide on the next tree based on their role, and it works really well. The cartographer is marking the tree, so whether you've got a GPS unit or a phone or a piece of paper, the photographer's got the camera or another phone, taking 2 shots, long shot and close-up, and the recorder is keeping track of what everybody's doing and why they're picking that particular tree. If you're doing this with kids at home, it can be done. There are a couple of challenges, and that is the resource material. If the students don't have a printer at home, then what do you do? That's going to be the big challenge, I think, and probably you're going to have to print everything off and send it to their home schools, and they pick it up. I'm not sure if there's a better way. We might be able to decide that. But that is the biggest challenge, is getting them the materials. They could do it electronically, load the PDF onto a tablet or even a phone, but that's not a good way to try and read all that stuff. The other thing they're going to need is a phone, whether they have one or maybe they can borrow a parent phone. But all the other jobs can be done on MyMaps. And that's actually a really great thing about using that, is you can mark the tree, you can put in the description, and you can even take the picture of the tree, and it's all embedded in MyMaps. And you're pretty much done at that point. You don't have to do, you may have to go back and edit a few things, but that's pretty easy. As far as choosing a tree, well, my slide all messed up there. Depending on the role, you are looking for different things about the trees. And again, that just allows a different selection of trees to get chosen probably than, you know, everybody picking their favorite tree or whatever. But it ends up being really engaging, and we've had a lot of success with this program at Tufts. Marking the location, you can either use the GPS, the phone, or on a piece of paper, just write on there and circle where you think you are. And with the satellite imagery, they'll probably be pretty accurate as to where that tree actually is. Taking a photo, long shot and close-up, and for the tree lover, the close-up may or may not be super helpful, but for all the other roles, getting a close-up should help see why they're picking that tree. And recording details, simple enough. The recording person just make sure the other two people did their job and write down why the tree was chosen. And again, with a virtual classroom, maybe you get your students to walk down the block or go to a local park. Students will need to do all 4 jobs. So again, in MyMaps, that takes care of 3 of the jobs. The urban forester, if they pick that, the resources that we have are based on kind of common trees that we found were on TDSB property. So they might have to use a different tool to identify all the trees that they pick. So there's a couple of apps that you can get for Android and iOS. And even Google Lens lets you take pictures of the leaves and they'll hopefully identify it. And there are...
Sorry to interrupt, Chris. Just about 30 more seconds.
Well, you might have to let me go a little bit longer. And there's a tree map for each school on the TDSB Web Facility Services page, so you can take a look at that. If a student has a Chromebook at home, you can't use Google Earth, which is what the project is based on, but they can do it in MyMaps, and if they did it on the phone, it might be done already. We found that an hour is a great amount of time for a dozen trees. You can do it over a number of days if you want to spread that out. And back in class, the biggest challenge there is downloading and sharing all of the different information. So whoever did the MyMaps part has to log in on the computer and export it as a Google Earth file. If you've got a paper map, then you can make copies of that and people can redo the locations in Google Earth. Downloading the photos, of course, that might be easiest done by just emailing the photos to themselves and then they can share them that way. You can try plugging the phone into the computer. And the record sheet might have to get copied as well and passed around. So this is what it takes to export the file in MyMaps. You click the little 3-dot menu and then choose the export to KML. That will give you the Google Earth file. And again, you can also edit it in here as well. And making the tour, I suggest using Google Earth. It's really easy to do. You can add photos and descriptions. At Tusk, we work in partnerships, but maybe that can't be done at the moment, and each student will have to make the project, or they take turns on it, perhaps. The older students, you might want to use Arcgis Online, and I suggest using the story map feature there. That's a really exciting way to add the descriptions and photos to the map. And I can link to, I have some help videos that you can use for both of these. The Arcgis ones are based on a Tusk program, so some instructions might be a little bit different, but they can see how to do it. And if you're doing everything on paper, you'll have to print out the photos and maybe do a large format paper map that they can put them all on. And this is kind of what it looks like in Google Earth once you've added the description and the tree photos, and you can make an automated tour that flies through all of the trees and pops up the information. I'm not going to talk much about this. In fact, I won't talk at all because we're running out of time, but these will be available for you to look at based on your grade level and what you might want to do to spice it up or make it a little bit different. And we are discussing just recoveries here. So here are some eco-justice ideas. And unfortunately, my slides adding to yours, Pam's, are cutting off a bunch of stuff. So I'm gonna have to reformat that so that you can see everything because there's more there. And as well, you can do the same thing with ecoliteracy. These are some questions that you can ask yourself and your students about how you might extend this project or do something else to add to their ecoliteracy.
Great, thank you, Chris. I'm always blown away by how much is involved in, melding the technology to the work outside. But really, this is all about connecting students to the places that they live, looking with the critical eco-justice lens, understanding trees from a different perspective, whether it be Indigenous perspective or even from the trees perspective. And then again, looking at where are trees and where are they not. There are two more resources I want to point out in terms of nurturing that sense of place and building the ecological identity. So kids get connected because we want those hearts to be connected. This one I love is from an Indigenous perspective. Megan Bang is from Northwest University in Seattle, and they really look at place from all kinds of layers, geographical, historical, culture, and she even invites the families in to share their wisdom, including a field-based component. So definitely check that out. Next slide talks about a New York initiative called What's Good in My Hood. I really like that because it is a workbook that students could download and then they could examine their neighborhoods, looking through lenses of water and food, and really moving to, now that you know your place, same with the trees, now that you know the trees, what can we do? And that's ultimately how we connect the heart, the heads, and the hands. Okay, so next slide. I am introducing Jenn. She's going to whip through some things around waste. And of course, we can't not talk about her dogs. Although quickly, Jenn, because I know you take up the whole slideshow. So take it away, Jenn.
Hi, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Pam. Thank you, Chris, for those amazing presentations. I'm Jenn Vetter, the EcoSchool specialist at the TDSB. On the left, that's Hunter, who's had a little bit of some medical issues lately, and our new puppy, Digby. As Hillary mentioned, you can find us by the lake every day. And I will move on because we're not here to talk about dogs. So next slide, Chris. So now let's hear from some of you. If you can, put some of your ideas in the chat. How have you connected your students to where they live? And that could be going back to the spring when we were, doing the virtual teaching, or, just in recent times. So please share your ideas with us, and let's, hear from some of you now. Oh, fall walk. Yes, Georgia, that's lovely. Wonderful fall walk. Any Kids for National Tree Day chose their special tree on school grounds, study it through the seasons, neighborhood walks. Yes, amazing. Yeah, it's great to try to get them outside. Digging in an educational garden, a great way to learn about seasonal change. Thanks, Hillary. Next slide, Chris. We'll just, as Pam said, we're short on time. So in this picture, we just want to ask you, what do you notice and what do you wonder about the image that you see here? So I've noticed, yes, it is a local beach, Linda. It is actually Woodbine Beach. And I've noticed on my daily dog walks that my neighborhood park has been extremely full of litter. Same with I walk along the bluffs. The beaches are full of litter, and my local park has always had lots of garbage cans, Marion, and recycling bins, and yet it doesn't seem to get to the to the places that we want it to get to. Yes, human influence, the tagged bird plus the litter. And so we've seen during COVID-19 that the amount of waste and litter in our green spaces and parks has really increased. I wonder if garbage will have the trash bin. Yes, Maddie, that's also been an issue. And in doing our research, I came upon some information from the City of Toronto that even though they have recycling and garbage bins and green bins in our parks and on our beaches, that everything has gone to landfill. It was so contaminated, even if it did make it into the bins, that none of it was able to, be recycled. So, this is where, Pam has been talking to us today about, that connection to the land and how, how do we make that connection to the land, in Indigenous ways of knowing. Mother Earth it's part of them, it's part of their being. And they have a sense of responsibility of taking care of that land, whereas, land in Western society is much more of a commodity. We own it. So, taking care of it is really important. Chris, next slide. So, how does this happen? We sort of touched on, people are more likely to litter when they don't feel a sense of ownership of our public spaces. Our First Nations worldview and philosophy, they have a deep and genuine relationship with the earth. And the, before the mainstream construct of Mother Earth became popular, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people, truly connected with the earth. The natural world is considered home, and the rightful stance is to be respectful, and they're interconnected, and it's about stewardship and gratitude. So land, they see land as their mother. It's steeped in their culture, but they also feel a sense of responsibility to take care of it, and that is something that we've always been trying to instill in our students. Next slide, Chris. So we've talked over the years in EcoSchools about littering and how it's bad for the environment. It's one of the big things that we've sort of seen through our research is that we can't regulate the emissions from litter as we can when things end up in a landfill. So plastics are ending up in our waterways. They're harming our wildlife. Arsenic from cigarettes is tainting the soil and water, and really that's just the tip of the iceberg. Next slide, Chris. So, this brings us back to that question that, when Pam was speaking about Mitchell Thomas Show and the 4 questions, what is my purpose and responsibility as a human being? So this is where, we can pull on the heartstrings, and it's another connection to our identity. We want to make systems visible to our students. So we can ask them, should we be taking responsibility? When should we be taking responsibility? Where should we take responsibility? And how should we take responsibility? There's lots of opportunity here for inquiry. And, when we are asking them, on their neighborhood walks, like, what are you noticing? What do you see? The issue of waste, if that comes up as something that they notice, and as we are building their observation skills, we have seen that does happen. Then it's, what role can we take? And starting in kindergarten, it can be that, garbage hurts animals. To our high school students who, may ask questions about, who is profiting from the contracts that produce these items, such as, we see a lot of masks here. And why aren't they taking responsibility for their waste? Why isn't that an issue? Our government, our provincial government, was going to make businesses take responsibility as part of the circular economy. We know that we're in a global pandemic right now and there is a health crisis, but, we also have a government that was committed to continuing with what the Liberals had passed, that we would move into this circular economy. So it behooves us to really stay on top of making sure that, that still happens, because while we are seeing all this waste in our neighborhoods, in our parks, on our beaches, where is the responsibility lying? So, we really want to stay on top of that. Next slide, Chris. So learning about waste issues, so where do the things I consume come from and what is their impact? We're not going to go into too much detail here. Maddie has pulled this all together in a Google Doc, and it will be part of the package that we send out after the webinar with resources for you. So we want to, you to know that you will have access to all of that. Next slide, Chris. So I'm going to really speed through this because the issue of single-use plastics, we were at a point in time where in 2021, our federal government was going to be passing legislation regarding the use of single-use plastics. At the TDSB, we had worked on a policy for the use of single-use water bottles. British Columbia, we saw things, legislation being passed there. But now with COVID-19, we are consuming 250 to 300% more single-use plastic than we did pre-pandemic. 129 billion face masks are being used globally every month. More takeout containers, drinks, food delivery. So the use of single-use plastic is, we're consuming more than we did before. So how do we, and our governments weren't thinking about this when they were creating the legislation. So how do we, now think about that in the context of being in a health crisis? Next slide, Chris. So in our day-to-day, right, we've had teachers and principals contacting us about our own disposable waste. Teachers, we're given 2 masks a day. Can we use 1 so that we're reducing that usage by 50%? Next slide, Chris. There's some nursing organizations, registered nurses, who have been providing information to, ask us, like, are we throwing our mask out too early? How can we store that mask between uses during the day? And there's some health and safety information that they've provided. Again, all of these links will be as part of the resources that we send out after. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about it, but just, thinking about the ways we can try to reduce and model for our students. Next slide, Chris. And, and some of the hopeful stories, Pam has talked about that, it's about stories. So hopeful stories are that if our students are wearing reusable masks every day, we've estimated there's about 180,000 attending in-person school. Each student wearing a reusable mask diverts about 720 kilograms from landfill every day. So, that's important, right? Add that over a week, a month, and a year. We also have a Toronto high school teacher, Rachel Thomas, who created Love Masks because she wanted to make sure that all of our families, especially our families that are in communities that are of high need, would have access to reusable masks so that they wouldn't have to take the single-use mask. So it's important to see that there are teachers in this case getting together to help support our communities that really need it. And then in, just a heartwarming story, there's a fellow in Ottawa who has bunnies, and he's recycled his disposable masks to help his little bunnies lounge in hammocks. So, you know, there's some good news happening out there as well.
Thanks. I was thinking how we could make hammocks for Hunter and Digby, but yeah. Thanks, Jen. So ideally, when we're talking about connecting waste issues, it comes at, you know, Jen came at it from understanding our place, but that you could also understand where things are coming from and what's my responsibility. The last question I just want you to be aware of is this question number 3, is understanding how we connect, how different people connect. And so a real piece with the eco-justice lens is centering voices that have been historically oppressed. And so from Alaska to Australia, scientists are turning to the knowledge of traditional people for a deep understanding of the natural world. You know, and what they are learning is helping discover more about everything from melting Arctic ice to protecting fish stocks to controlling wildfires. And Jada really talks about that our environmental education, we have been moving forward, but we need to continue moving forward to decolonize our practice and incorporate our ways of knowing our mental models so that it's not so focused on us and the Anthropocene. Next slide, please. Of course, you may have heard of the TED Talk, A Danger of a Single Story. And that's, again, really important. You know, white people have been centric, you know, the environmental movement has been focused on white people, but really people of color and have always been very connected when we look at the history books. And so they're kind of looking at us going, you know, where have you been? And so really bringing the different stories, Braiding Sweetgrass. If you don't know it, it is a lovely, amazing book. Lots of stuff on eco-justice. Again, you know, Black Faces, White Spaces was another book I mentioned. 2 books for students that are new. One, Earth, People of Color Protecting Our Planet, and Environmentalists from Our First Nations, and learning about stories that are different than the dominant culture. Next slide, please. Again, teaching intersectionality in eco-justice in our classrooms. So again, if you're working with climate justice, you know, how do we teach that in a way that confronts racism, economic inequality, misogyny, militarism, xenophobia, and really imagines a just and green recovery. A great source for this is the Zinn Education Project with Rethinking Schools. They have articles, lessons, books, films. They even have this whole thing on teaching climate justice. Next slide, please. So just want to wrap this up because, again, we started with, you know, how could environmental education contribute to a just and sustainable recovery? And I think the important thing is to have that vision of where we want to go. So that vision of, we want sustainable communities where people can interact with confidence and that the environment is both safe, nurturing, and productive. And also we desire a future where people, all people, can realize their potential, but where both cultural and biological diversity are respected and highly revered, and where distributed justice prevails. And that isn't my understanding of eco-justice. This comes from Professor Bryant. You've seen a lot about just recoveries. And again, we want to have the students re-envision theirs, and so that they're working towards the just recovery that they see, and they get to know that by using those 4 questions. What do I know about the place and the land where I live? How do, you know, where do things come from? The things that I consume, and where do they go? How do I connect? How do other people connect? How is their story? How can I bring their story to light? And lastly, what responsibility can we take? And then leading to, again, connecting the heart, hands, and head all together. So thank you for joining us. Of course, we have recorded this webinar, so Chris's stuff I probably will go through again for my own purposes. We do have outdoor ed staff here that will talk, that can again, come to your schoolyards and work with you to help you implement some of this stuff. And just be aware of our upcoming webinars. We are focused on eco-justice this year. So we've got activist approaches to educational gardening. We have eco-racisms in the park, the Black Canadian experience. We have Indigenous land-based teaching and learning. And we hope to continue to have a focus on eco-justice and centering stories of people that haven't had a chance to really come to the forefront. Thanks. I see some questions. Over to you, Hillary.
And thank you to all three of you for really starting to figure this out. This is a brand new field for all of us, not eco-justice itself, but this notion of a just recovery. And so you folks are doing some ground cutting thinking here about how to take this to a level that we know will work with everything from kindergarten right through grade 12 students. So I appreciate the effort and energy you put in. If everybody can just join me in thanking our speakers for today. Bravo, very nice work. I do know that Lori Yaz, who's with TOES, the Outdoor Ed Department at TDSB, I think wants to contribute to this conversation as well. So I'm going to invite Lori at this point to take the floor.
Hi, everybody. I'm very cognizant of the time. It's 5:01, so I'm just going to mention very briefly. We in the TOES department are also trying to support all of you in taking your kids outside, whether it's in person or virtually. So I wanted to share this morning. I'll go into the chat as soon as I finish talking, and I'll share. We have what's called an intake form, and it's direct link to a form, and you just fill it out, and somebody will be in touch with you to get a little bit more specifics on what you need or want from us. And we have a variety of ways to help you, whether it's we come to your school, whether we meet with your class virtually, whether we do some after school PD with teachers, whether we have just collaborate with you in creating some ideas. So I'm going to stop talking because I know Tina Packer is from our department, and she's also got something from the resources that's really, really cool to share. It'll take 2 minutes. So I'll stop, and I'll put the intake form as well as our TOES website. And just so you know, our TOES website is an ongoing thing, and we're going to have so many more resources added to it in the next little while. So please visit us. I'll put it in the chat. Thanks for letting me speak.
So hi, super quick. I'm an outdoor education specialist with Outdoor Ed TOES and part of the resource committee. And one of the things that we are offering is we're just starting up office hours for TDSB staff who would like to ask questions, get clarification on things, maybe some ideas. So we're going to offer one for anyone that's in this presentation today from TDSB on Thursday this week from 3 o'clock till 4 o'clock. And I'll put the info in the chat in just a second. If you are interested in being part of this office hours Q&A, then email me, so Tina Packer at tdsb.on.ca. I'll put it in the chat in just a second, and put in your subject line OE office hours, and then I will send you directly the link for the office hours for this Thursday. After this, as of next week, we should have the office hours set up on our website, and you'll just be able to go there. But for this week, you're going to have to go through me.
Thank you so much, Tina. Great to hear that TOES is figuring out ways to work in this pandemic. I know that so many teachers are really looking forward to your support in getting and keeping their students outside as we go through seasonal change in the fall and into the winter. So I think we're going to aim for another webinar somewhere maybe early December on how to work with students outside in ways that are safe and comfortable and enriching for all involved, which is great.